Thank you all for joining us here this afternoon at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. For all of us in-house, we appreciate your checking that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. We do, of course, have copies of today's book, Saturday People, Sunday People, available for your purchase, and our author will be glad to sign them. We'll do that here in this room for everyone's convenience afterwards. Lela Gilbert is a freelance writer and editor. She has authored and co-authored more than 60 books. Lee Edwards will be jealous here at Heritage. She serves as an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she and Hudson Senior Fellow Paul Marshall authored Blind Spot, When Journalists Don't Get Religion. She and Mr. Marshall also co-wrote the award-winning 1996 survey of anti-Christian persecution, Their Blood Cries Out. Among her other books are Persecuted, The Global Assault on Christians, co-authored Thomas Nelson publication of this year, and Baroness Cox, Eyewitness to a Broken World. Ms. Gilbert is a contributor to numerous news publications, including the Jerusalem Post, the Weekly Standard, Jewish World Review, and National Review Online. And for those of us who have had the wonderful opportunity to visit Israel, I'm sure it is a great pleasure for us today, especially to hear from someone who spends a great deal of time there and just to learn finally about the normal everyday life in our good friends, the Israelis' country. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the podium.
Thank you very much.
And I'll be back for questions.
Good. Thank you. Well, I do thank you for your warm welcome. I came from California a couple of days ago, and I was rather stunned when I actually got out of the plane, and I thought we had hot weather, but this is something else. It's nice inside. I actually grew up in Southern California. I was born there post-war, and my parents were self-described Christian fundamentalists. They believed the Bible. My mother was a Bible teacher. They were Baptists. And one of the most important things about their faith, at least for my father, was the regathering of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, which took place during the 20th century, but the nation itself was established just after I was born. And I grew up with the heroism, hearing about the heroism of the Jewish armies, about the miracle of all these people coming back to the land, and in subsequent years, the other battles that were fought on behalf of the little country that could, so to speak. And so for me, it was always in the back of my mind that I would go there. I wanted to visit. I wanted to see what life was like. I was curious, but I didn't go for many, many years. I wanted to go with my father after my mother passed away, and then he was unable to go. So it was in the back of my mind. I'd had my way paid to all over the place, Uganda and Hong Kong and I don't know where else, all over, Russia. But nobody ever volunteered to pay my way to Israel. So 2006, I went with some friends to Egypt. I was standing on a beach on the Gulf of Aqaba in a little town called Nuweiba. We were on our way to St. Catherine's in Mount Sinai. And our guide pointed out that to the right I could see Saudi Arabia, straight ahead I could see Jordan, and just to the left was Israel, 40 miles away. And I felt this surge of frustration and almost excitement, and I had an epiphany at that moment that if I didn't get myself to Israel, I would be like Moses, having seen the land from afar and never having set foot there. So I went back to California and I made a reservation. I had some miles on British Airways, so I was able to get myself there. I went online, I found an apartment, rented it for 4 months, sight unseen, and packed up my bags and went. So happened that I went in the middle of a war, which was not really poor planning on my fault. It just was one of those Israeli things that happens. But that was the best time I could have possibly gone, because what I saw was the Jewish people united as one during a time of great turmoil. There were rockets coming in. I think there were over 4,000 rockets shot during that 3 or 4 week period. And I was traveling around with a group of people that were sort of on a mission. They were mostly Jewish people. I think I was the only Christian on this trip. And so we were at risk of being hit by rockets. And that gave me a sense of what it was like to live there, even though it was going to stop and it wasn't going to go on forever. It really gave me a sense of that constant uncertainty that people live with. But the first question people always want to know is, why did I stay? And I'm not sure I know why I stayed. I just never left. I was on a 3-month visa. I had a tourist visa for the first 3 months, and I had to renew it every 3 months. But I was working on a book with Baroness Cox at the time in England. And so it was easier for me to fly back to Israel. So I just renewed the lease on the apartment, which turned out, by the way, to be in the very nicest part of town. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was beautiful. My neighbors were charming. They came to see me. They invited me over. I was made to feel at home very quickly, and thanks to good friends, I made friends quickly. I found a good friend in one of the editors of the Jerusalem Post, Ruthie Bloom, who's still a very close friend of mine. She took something I wrote and put it in the paper, and the next thing I knew, I was doing something I'd never done before, which was writing for the newspaper, occasionally, mostly observations of a Christian in Israel. And that was how it all began for me. It began with holidays, the Jewish holidays, which I had very little awareness of how they were celebrated. I knew the dates. It so happened my birthday fell on New Year's that year, so it was a good beginning for me in my trip. My long sojourn is what it turned out to be. But one of the things that happened while I was there was that I began to see that as I wrote for the paper and read the paper, I realized that I really didn't know the truth about some of the situations that I was surrounded with. One of the first things that happened was Jimmy Carter's book on apartheid Israel came out the first Christmas, the first winter I was there. Every bookstore had his picture. And even my landlady, who was living in the US, who was very leftist, was extremely upset about this book. And I didn't know much about why it was done. I knew it was about, the Palestinians weren't being treated fairly and this and that, but that they didn't belong in this society. But I didn't really know much about it, so I started looking into it. The first thing I was fortunate enough to find out was that a man that I knew was a South African who had actually had to flee apartheid because he had a black church. He had a church with blacks and coloreds and everybody in there, and he was very disrespected by the South African government. Someone warned him that he was actually about to be arrested, so he fled to Israel. So I met him at an event, and I said, "Have you ever been interviewed about apartheid and how you see this accusation in this book?" And he said, no, he'd never talked about it. And I said, well, would you allow me to interview you? I would give you the opportunity to change anything or whatever, but I just want to know what you think, but I think other people might too. And that was sort of the beginning, really, of my book, because it was the first time I'd ever written something like that, where I was actually exploring and investigating to some degree what was going on in the world. And what happened was I found out that this was a complete lie. Apartheid is absurd. It's an absurd accusation about Israel. Sometimes it's related to the wall, that it's supposedly dividing everyone up, and it does. It keeps people from suicide bombing inside of Israel, and it's worked very effectively. But in terms of the people, I guess the best example that I have is the mall in Mamilla, which is a new mall, sort of a fashion mall, that connects with the Jaffa Gate. I go there on Fridays, or Thursdays or Fridays often, to shop for whatever I need. And I noticed one day, I was meeting a friend for lunch, a Jewish woman for lunch. At the table next to us were Muslims. The women were covered, and they had the babies, and their husbands were sitting there with them. And at the next table were Orthodox Jews who were very clearly dressed. You can tell what people believe in Israel by how they dress, or at least some people. And in this case, there were Christians, of course, sitting around, visitors with tours. They had the little hats that said something about their church. And I'm thinking, this is apartheid. These people are all eating in the same restaurant at the same time. I went in the Mac store to buy some eye makeup, and these women with beautiful designer scarves, covered with scarves, were debating with the Jewish clerk about the color of eyeshadow they should be wearing, and they were kind of taking so much time that I left. It was just not what I would call apartheid. So I went back to Malcolm Heading, who's the man that was kicked out of South Africa, and I said, did they shop in the same stores at the same time? And he gets very angry about all this. And he said, they can't even shop in the same places. They can't eat in the same restaurants. That's the way it was. And he said, this is so far removed from anything like that, he said it made him furious. So I wrote a little bit more about that. That was the first thing that I tripped over as sort of a journalism issue that I wanted to write about. The next thing were the rockets that were coming in, because every few weeks there would be a barrage of rockets in the south of Israel. And this went on all the time I was there. I think I read that there were over 8,000 rockets launched from Gaza after the Jews evacuated. What happened was that Sharon, the prime minister, made a unilateral decision to evacuate 8,000 Jews from Gaza, so that everyone was complaining about the Jews in Gaza, the occupation. So they all left. They didn't want to. There was a huge scene, but they left, and there were no Jews left. And so as soon as that happened, they destroyed the remaining radical Palestinians, destroyed the greenhouses that had been left for them. They destroyed the homes. They destroyed the synagogues. Everything was trashed. And then they started shooting these little Qassam rockets, which were depicted in the media as made in grandma's garage. They were just little, like, fireworks. They weren't really dangerous, except they kill people quite often. They certainly damaged property. They set fires, but they weren't taken seriously in the media, especially the BBC. And what was taken seriously was the fact that Israel retaliated from time to time, going in with large either helicopter gunships or fighter jets, and targeting specific people who were responsible for the rockets. They knew where they were, and they went in. And that's what appeared in the BBC. And then it would imply that the rockets were a small retaliation for this brutal attack by the Israelis. I had the opportunity to go down into the area right around Gaza and interview some people that lived there. And this was quite a revelation. A Christian group had decided to pay for those people to have to have a weekend away because of the months that they had spent with sirens going on and off all day, all night. And these were elderly people. Some of them had actually founded the kibbutz that they lived on. And so I talked to them, and one of them said, "What are you doing here? My family won't even come and visit me here. Aren't you afraid to be here?" And I said, "Not particularly, but I can leave and you can't, so I want to hear what you have to say." And what I learned was that just about everyone there are 1 million people within range of those rockets. Many of them are on antidepressants, they're on anti-anxiety drugs, their children are bedwetters. They live in a constant state of upheaval because those sirens go off. They have about 15 seconds to get to a safe room in their house or a shelter. It goes on all the time. It even happened yesterday again. It didn't hit anything. The rockets that are going off now are not specifically Hamas. Hamas is responsible because Hamas is the governing body in Gaza, but these are little radical groups that are trying to stir things up. Still going on. Sirens still go off. That was another thing I wrote about. I wrote about the people. What was it like for the people? And the more I talked to them, in fact, we were hearing explosions as I was interviewing these elderly people. They just wanted a night's sleep, but they also wanted peace. They wanted the people in Gaza to not have to worry about attacks, too. They were very compassionate, and I was very surprised at their attitude. The third thing I came across, which was a surprise to me, and I still can hardly believe it, was that Yasser Arafat told Jimmy Carter and company, or not Jimmy Carter, excuse me, Bill Clinton and company, that there was never a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. When I first got there, we went to the Temple Mount. We were warned not to pray, not to open any Bibles, not to take Bibles with us. The rules are pretty much like the rules in Saudi Arabia about Christians and Jews. Nobody's supposed to pray there. Nobody's supposed to sing there. If they see Jews that are clearly Jewish, probably they would think they were settlers with the side curls and any kind of garb that's distinctive with the fringes. If they see their lips moving, they'll be arrested and removed from the Temple Mount. And yet, this is the place where everything began in Judaism in terms of the Kingdom of David. Solomon's temple, even before that there was a temple there. And today we have the Dome of the Rock and we have the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's no Jewish presence apart from police, and very often they aren't allowed to go there. In fact, this last Monday was Tisha B'Av, which is a day that the Jews grieve over the lost temple. It's the day that it was lost in both the first and second temple generations. And they went up there, and they were expelled because of the fear of rioting with Muslims. So I began to explore why Arafat would say there was no temple there in the first place. There was never a temple on the Temple Mount. Now, that pretty well does in both the Old and New Testaments. If it's not true, they're not true. I mean, it all ties together, and Christians should be just as alarmed as Jews if there was never a temple. So I spoke to an archaeologist named Gabriel Barkay, who is a man who was sort of fell into the job of sifting through the debris from illegal digging that went on under the Al-Aqsa Mosque by the Palestinians, the Waqf, which is the managing organization over the Temple Mount. They took 400 dump trucks of dirt, which contained invaluable artifacts, and dumped them in landfills around Jerusalem, secretly at night. Somebody found out about this and took a bag of dirt and dumped it on Gabriel Barkay's dining table and said, are you going to go through this or not? Are you going to take an interest in this or not? This needs to be sorted through. It took him a long time to get the antiquities organizations to cooperate, but since that time, he has been going through that stuff. And he has found not only First Temple, Second Temple artifacts, coins, seals, very important findings, but a huge amount of Christian evidence of a basilica that was there before the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He said this should be just as important to Christians as to Jews. Of course, that's true in terms of Jesus having been in the temple. But beyond that, there was a Justinian church there. So once again, we have this incredible lying going on, the incredible misinterpretation, but that was just a lie. It's just a lie that there was no temple there. But there's a process going on of de-Judifying Israel, taking away the Jewish roots and saying the Jews are recent intruders from Northern Europe, and they never really belonged there, and there's this whole genetic lie that was told that's been disproved, but it still comes up that they really aren't related to the Jews at all, these Northern Europeans. Well, on it goes. The big point is don't believe anything you read in the newspaper unless you can check it out some other way, because so much of it, particularly BBC and some of the more anti-Semitic, I would say, publications just never stop. But the biggest thing I learned, and the thing that ended up pulling my book together and pulling the ideas together from my book, was something that I tripped over, literally. I walked into a conference, a session in a conference. I was at the Herzliya conference in 2009, which is held every year. It's sort of a securities conference. It also brings together a lot of diplomats and all sorts of scholars. And there was this day, I didn't have anything scheduled at a particular hour, so I walked into a workshop on something called, it was a film, a documentary that was being released by the David Project, and it was called The Forgotten Refugees. And as I sat there, I was sort of not sure what I was hearing. Most of it was translated into English, but I realized that this was a story of people who had been expelled from Muslim countries. There were, so I learned, 850,000 Jews expelled from Muslim countries between 1948 and 1970, nearly 1 million. There were more Jews expelled from those countries than there were Palestinians who abandoned their homes in Israel, which refugees we hear about constantly. These are the ones always in the arguments about the peace process and so forth. This other group of refugees has been in the headlines. It's never been talked about. In fact, even in Israel, a lot of the Jewish people there, excuse me, don't really know much about this. And this completely blew me away. The people started doing Q&A at the end of the session, and they were weeping because they themselves had accompanied their parents on these awful ships and through awful escapes to get to Israel. And they were weeping about what they left behind. They nearly all left with the shirts on their backs. Many of them had very tight connections to the kings and the leadership of these countries. They were wealthy people. They were unable to take their money out. The land that was confiscated, it has been estimated, equals 5 times the square mileage of the state of Israel. That's how much land they left behind. They left with a suitcase. They left with sometimes their wedding ring. They went to Israel. They lived in tents for sometimes as long as a year, and they started over. Why haven't we heard about this? One of the main reasons that I got interested in this was that I had heard about this saying, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. This was graffiti on the walls in Bethlehem. It's jihadi graffiti. And I didn't really understand what it meant, except that the Jews were being targeted and then the Christians. But I found out that this real statement, which is inside my book, there's a flag with this Arabic writing that says, on Saturday we kill the Jews, on Sunday we kill the Christians. And this is not a new thing. One of our scholars at Hudson has found this dates back, all the way back to 1948 at least. But it's a common statement. We see it a lot. The Jews are the Saturday people, of course. They worship on Saturday, and the Christians worship on Sunday. And people say to me, what about the Friday people? And I said, well, they're the ones that made the slogan up, so they've got their own books. I didn't write about them too much. I have 2 chapters where I interviewed Palestinian Arabs, but the book is about the Jews and Christians. And because I'd done these other books that you mentioned about Christian persecution, I was well aware of what was going on in some of the same countries that the Jews had been expelled from. But I hadn't realized how clearly the connection had been made. The Jews that left told me, I interviewed many of them, and one of them said to me, an Egyptian woman who fled, said to me, the neighbors, the Coptic Christian neighbors, took care of them. The fathers were all thrown in prison after the 48 war, and again after the 67 war. They were thrown in prison in Egypt, so the wives had to take care of their kids, and they knew they were going to have to leave the country. The Coptic Christians came to them and brought them food, brought them bread, and said, we know we're next. We know we're next. You'll go, and then we'll go. And what's happening today? In Egypt, the Copts are fleeing in huge numbers. Churches are getting as many as 1,000 more Coptic churches. I just spoke to a Coptic man. I spoke in San Francisco at a meeting between Jews and Coptic Christians there, trying to find some way of working together. And he said there were 1,000 new people just in his San Francisco church alone, Copts that had fled. And these are the ones with money. These are the ones that can afford to fly. They can afford to get a lawyer. They can afford to get asylum somehow. There are at least 8 million Copts. They are in the gun sights of the Muslim Brothers right now because their brave new pope sat on the podium with the new declared president in Egypt. They are just waiting for trouble, and it's already happening. There was a beheading last week in Sinai. There have been several murders. It's inevitable. Where will they go? They have no Israel to go to. I don't have to tell you what's going on in Syria, but the Christians there are in dire straits. They're caught in the crossfire because they're accused of supporting Assad, who, like Saddam Hussein, actually did protect minorities to some degree. He was an equal opportunity terrorist, but he was better to some Christians than the radical Muslims. So Syria, they're fleeing, the church is ripped apart, and tragically many of them had fled Iraq and gone to Syria and Jordan, and now they're having to figure out what's next. Iraq, the Christian church, when I say the church, I mean the entire body of Christians, has been reduced to less than half since the Iraq War because of the terrorism of the Shia and Sunnis back and forth, and the Christians getting, not in the crossfire, but getting attacked to unite the Muslims. So what we have is, we have less than 5,000 Jews left in 10 Arab states since these expulsions, and now the Christians are quietly fleeing. They're leaving. And Israel is the only country in the Middle East where the Christian community is growing. There was an interesting change in the last couple of weeks, which I find very hopeful. There are Arab Christians now asking if they can join the IDF, the Israeli military. It seems that under the leadership of at least one very courageous priest, or Eastern Orthodox priest, they have determined that the fate of Christians under Islam is not so good after all. They've practiced a very, what we call dhimmitu, they've practiced a form of behavior under the authority of Islam in which they're subservient and they keep quiet, they don't speak up about politics, they keep to themselves, and they sort of keep a low profile, and it doesn't rock the boat. But these new young Copts are saying, we're Christians, we're proud to be Christians, and this Greek Orthodox priest in Israel is saying, you are Israelis, feel free to fight, enlist in the army. And they're doing so, and they've started a political party, and they're calling themselves the Sons of the New Testament. And they want to be recognized not as, their identity wants to be changed from Arab Christians to Israeli Christians, because this is their country, and they see that it's the only safe place for them. So these are changes that are happening. The Saturday people have left all those countries, and there's still abuse of Jews in the ones that are left. They've had trouble in North Africa. There's still a community in Morocco. There's one in Tunisia. There was trouble there as recently as this year. The Jews are not totally safe. And of course, what we have is Iran threatening to blow up the entire country, which some people don't take seriously, except if you live in Israel, you take it very seriously, that this is a possible thing. And what will happen with this bomb, nobody knows. Nobody knows if the Israelis will attack. The Christians and Jews have common ground. Their common ground is the Bible, first of all. Their common ground is their faith in one God, and I believe it's the same God. And their common ground is bloodied soil under their feet, where so many lives have been lost. My hope is that they will learn, we will all learn to, yes, we have differences, but to get past those things and come together and take a stand against this radicalism and against the abuse of so many people, for totally innocent people, only because they are Christian or because they are Jews. I hope somehow we can begin to bring the Saturday people and Sunday people together, and with faith in God and with prayer, but also with action, do something about this increasing disaster that's going on in the Middle East and elsewhere. Thank you.
I know that we talked briefly out in front, and it's been eons ago that I was in Israel. I was always struck by how small the country itself is. Any other perspectives that you found when you were first there that kind of threw you, as well as some of the ones you've already mentioned, but just any aspect to it, as well as the fact that in spite of, probably not in Gaza, but in spite of the fact of all they were facing, there seems to be a serenity, in a way, among the people in that area too.
I think what I recognize, yes, there are two things. One is it is a very small country. It's the size of New Jersey. The waste of Israel is about 9 miles. But yes, the people have learned to celebrate life. And in spite of the fact that they've been through, 2,000 years of pogroms and inquisitions and every kind of horror you can think of, often in the name of Jesus, I'm sorry to say, not the Holocaust, but many of the other things, they still have learned to celebrate. And their joke is that the Jewish holidays are, the theme of the Jewish holidays is, they try to kill us, they failed, let's eat. So I don't know if it's serenity, but there's just a sense of we'll get through this. And, they usually do.
Okay, we have a microphone, and if you will wait for the microphone and please identify yourself as a courtesy, it'd be appreciated, and we'll continue with questions. Anybody else in the audience? Take your pick, Andrew.
Hi, Joseph Shackman with the Heritage Foundation. How is your book being received in the American Christian press?
I have to admit it's been more warmly received by Jews than anybody else. But the Christians that have read it, and I'm speaking at the Christians United for Israel Summit this weekend, and actually that's the first time I've spoken to a large Christian audience. So when they read it, they like it. I get letters, I get reviews on Amazon and so forth, but it has not permeated the Christian market as broadly as it has the Jewish market.
Hi, I'm Richard Corris. It seems like we're seeing this huge flight of Christians from persecution in the Middle East. We're seeing new Coptic churches opening to accommodate them. But we don't really seem to see it being brought to the public attention through protests or advocacy. I mean, they put these little articles in the paper from time to time, but people don't seem to be making a big deal about that.
Well, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that Jews always say, I can expect to hear it every time, why aren't Christians doing more about this? Jews come together, they had to come together for 2,000 years to support their communities, and most notably the Soviet Jewry movement during the time of the Iron Curtain. They organized, and even though there's a lot of infighting and everybody doesn't get along, they come together and they work. Christians are very, very divided. I suspect that some Christians aren't so sure these other people are Christians. They wear funny hats and they have incense, and evangelicals sometimes tend to see themselves as the true church. So I think part of it comes from that. Part of it comes from no media. I mean, like you said, little tiny notations. But really nobody's following this unless there's such a carnage. Like there was a church in Baghdad that was so bad that it actually made the news. Fox News does a little bit more of it than anybody else, but you really have to look to find out what's going on. And then there needs to be more organization. It's absolutely true. Center for Religious Freedom at Hudson Institute has a new website called persecutionreport.net, which is sort of like a drudge report. It's set up kind of like that by region, and it talks about Christian persecution. And it's easy to find out what's going on there. Things are updated frequently. But part of it's not knowing, part of it's not knowing what to do. Part of it is being pietistic and not being advocates. These are all issues. And there needs to be a coming together. And I don't know who has the organizational skills to do it, but I hope somebody does.
Josh Shepard with the Heritage Foundation. From your perspective, is Prime Minister Netanyahu following the right path in defending religious freedom and the heritage of Israel?
As far as I know, he is on the right track. He's surrounded by raging voices. Everybody loves to hate Bibi, whether they're on the right or on the left. Everybody is got something against him, whether he forgot to pick up the check in 1978 at dinner, or whether he's too nice to Obama, or whether he's saying, yes, let's negotiate, or whether, as far as I know, in terms of religious freedom, he has expressed concern about the Coptic people I know. I think there's been effort made, and this I'm not clear about, but I think some effort has been made to see if there's a place where they could find, some of them could find safety in Israel. That would be an explosive situation on all sides, and I don't know that it'll ever happen. But my sense is that he's on the right side of things, but heaven only knows what kind of pressure and who's pulling on him for what. I don't know enough about. Thankfully, I'm a disgrace because I don't speak Hebrew well at all. But it's a good thing I can't read the paper, or I would really lose my mind. So.
Bill Murray, Religious Freedom Coalition. We have on several occasions arranged for congressmen to go up to Ariel, as an example. Mm-hmm. And each occasion when they have got there, the State Department has managed to foil the plans and stop them from going into Ariel. And we can't get anybody there of note. We can't get elected officials of note. And this is why we have no publicity from quote, settlement areas, that they're actually large cities and this and that and the other thing. And I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions? What we need to do is to get high-profile people, and we've attempted and failed, but high-profile people into the areas where the missiles have hit, high-profile people into the west, into some areas so they can see that it isn't tense, because that's all that is depicted on the news media. Settlements are tense. They're not high-rise buildings. And
right.
We've both been there. I jog every morning in Ariel, believe it or not, up and down the hill. I do it. But we need to in order to get into the media, we have to have high-profile people. And I have no idea how to do it. Do you have any ideas?
So you have to work with the State Department to do this?
Yes, every congressman that we have arranged to go up to Ariel while they've been on a trip has been stopped from going across the Green Line by the State Department. Every single one of them. They're told they can't protect them, that they are violating, they'll tell them anything. We had one, I think it was Frank's, told he would be violating international law if he went to Ariel. So, but, this...
That's insane.
We have a... But there has to be some way to do something. Maybe, I don't know, but if you had any ideas.
Well, I'd have to think about that, but I didn't know that was the case.
Don't tell them they're going.
Well, they tell them. Well, they're on an official trip, so they have to.
Adam?
Adam Rickley with the Heritage Foundation. Bit of an inside baseball question about, I guess you could call it Zionism as somebody who's practicing Messianic and ends up straddling this Jewish Zionist versus Christian Zionist
Mm-hmm.
line.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the role, as somebody who hasn't been in Israel, I want to try to get a feeling of what is your opinion on the ability of Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists to cooperate with each other, because on one hand, that we're all striving towards the same goal, and it seems like most of the time we can get along, but on the other hand, I've been in discussions where I've been labeled an anti-Semite despite being a Zionist. I'm sure my rabbi would be happy to know that. And where you have people saying that Christian Zionists can't be Zionist, Christianity is inherently anti-Semitic. I'm hoping that group is small, but how big do you think, how is that working relationship?
You mean the relationship between Christian Zionists and Messianic Jews?
Messianics are a small enough group that they kind of end up in the middle, and that's its own.
You mean just Christians across the board is what you're talking about?
Well, or Christian Zionist groups and Jewish Zionist groups. How is their working relationship with each other?
Well, there's a certain amount of suspicion of Christian Zionists amongst the more religious Jews, because they have the sense, or they have believed or been told, possibly by leftists, that Christians are all over there to convert them, that they're not really concerned about them in any other way, and that Israel is just a field ready to be harvested for the kingdom of Christianity. So you do have that element, but there are Christians over there working with the government, working, speaking to people. I mean, it's not that everyone's ostracized, but there's a lot of fragmentation even within the Christian community there. The Catholic Arabs don't like the Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Arabs. Those Arabs don't necessarily know anything about the Copts. There is a Coptic patriarch in Jerusalem, but it's very fragmented and very isolated groups. And yes, there is a new theology, this new Palestinian theology, that Jesus was a Palestinian, and all the good guys in the story were Palestinian. The only bad guys in the story were Jews who killed Jesus. And that, you can't imagine, this stuff is so stupid, but it's very, very popular, and it's spreading because there's money behind it. There's Arab money behind it, Saudi money behind it. It's a new way of causing people to lose interest in the issue. If you believe the Bible, the new Pope, Catholic Pope, just said something to the effect of you can't be a Christian and an anti-Semite at the same time, a believing Christian. So I think we have, hopefully, an ally there. But yeah, it's a mess. I mean, it's a mess. And I hope with my life to be among the people and just be an example of Christian love and not with an agenda. I mean, it's not like an Amway party where, you go in there and you're nice to everybody and then you pull out the product at the end. And that happens, I'm sorry to say. So that's all I can say. You should go. Better to see for yourself, maybe.
I know Ken's got one down here in front. And a serious look on his face.
Hi, Ken Masugi, Johns Hopkins. I wanted to push you a bit further in your discussion of the different Christian groups, and in particular the role of the Catholic Church here. Of course, it's also officially the Vatican.
Mm-hmm.
So. And I noticed one Jewish friend of mine here who works with some of these Christian groups once complained to me, well, you never see Catholics, or you see very few Catholics involved. So I'm wondering how the Catholic Church or the Vatican behaves over in Israel, how they're helpful, how they could be more helpful.
A lot of the holy sites are operated by the Franciscan brothers. The Franciscans tend to be more willing to learn Hebrew, to be involved in events, to be present, and to interact with the Jewish community. There are others in the Catholic Church that have nothing to say about Israel except that it's an occupier and it'll be gone like all the other occupiers eventually. It's not a consistent picture. I heard the Custos speak about Syria. He's responsible for those communities, and he speaks Hebrew. I mean, it's so bad that some of them don't even want to speak Hebrew, and they don't want to learn it because it has no significance. I think this new pope may make a difference, but it's a fragmented situation. And there's the Curia. My understanding is that the Curia, during the time of Benedict, was very opposed to his speech at Regensburg and more or less silenced him after there was so much death afterwards. This man has come forth, and it was the plan of Benedict to canonize those victims of radical Islam or Islam back in the day. He did it. He canonized them. So he seems to have a little different attitude, and he wants to come to Israel. We'll have to see, but it's not consistent. And it depends on individuals, and it depends on the leadership of particular orders and particular outreaches from the Vatican. It's not clear.
Hello, Fracken of the Hudson Institute. I just wanted to make one comment, if I might, about the question that Mr. Masugi raised, that one thing that's not always appreciated is that all the churches that operate in Israel, especially in Jerusalem, lay claim to particular religious properties, different churches, different monasteries, But they lay claim, there are duplicative claims in many cases that between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches and other Eastern churches. And these disputes have been going on a long time. Israel often is in the position of being between the churches in their respective disputes, which are pursued through the courts and through international bodies. So one of the largest disputes, as far as I know, over the years, has been a dispute between the Vatican, strictly the Vatican, and the Eastern Orthodox churches about who has proper control and rights to different monasteries and churches, and that is not part of in any respect of Israel's concerns, except that they have jurisdiction over the other thing the question I wanted to ask was that, or prompt really, to Ms. Gilbert is, a large part of your book is, if I recall correctly, not about all the things that people read about in the paper, but what they don't, part of what you described, but also just what ordinary life is like in Israel, which from your description, resembles really very much life in the United States or in other Western countries. Would you want to comment a little bit about that?
Well, that's right. I realized not long after I got there that the word Israel is such an abstraction in America. And even with Christians, it's still, you hear people say, I just love the Jewish people, I love Israel. But they don't know anyone. They don't know any Israelis. They don't really know what the people are like. And so I have tried to paint a portrait of people and events and what it's like to be in the midst of these people. And you're right, that was what I actually started out to do with these articles I was writing. It was only after I realized there was a lot of stuff that needed to be answered that I got into other issues. But the Jewish people in Israel forget that they're Jewish. I mean, one of my friends, Ruthie, has 4 kids, and she worries. She says, I think they've forgotten they're Jews. They just see themselves as Israelis. And so there's not the same sense of dealing with Jews only. Even I forget that everybody's Jewish too, except religiously, because I'm Christian, so I don't I don't observe the same things. But I've found that there's sort of a saying that the Jews are sabrous, the Israelis are sabrous. A sabra is a cactus that is very prickly on the outside and very sweet on the inside. And I would say that's pretty accurate, except many of them are sweet on the outside too. But these are good, loving people. They're decent people. They have the same Judeo-Christian values that we have. They believe that man is made in the image of God, which in a way is the difference between the bloodthirstiness of some of their enemies and the decency of their armies and so forth. And so, yeah, I guess that is really what my book's about, but it's also, trying to explain some of these other things as well. Try to do a lot of things at once.
Let's do one more.
Al Milliken, AM Media. What more would you say about replacement theology, where some would claim that biblical covenant promises made to Israel has now gone to the Christian church?
Well, all I can say about that is that the promise made to Abraham in Genesis was for eternity. If God changed his mind, then we have a probably different God than we worship. I think replacement theology has been responsible for most of the anti-Semitism that's taken place in the last 2,000 plus years. And it's tragic. There's always been a small group of people that have stood with the Jews and said, these are the brothers and sisters of Jesus and his cousins. But it's a perversion, and it's terrible. And we need to be willing to argue for the Bible, for the truth of the Bible, for the truth of the promises of God, that they are from now and henceforth forevermore. It was not a conditional promise. It was a promise for eternity. And that's how we need to understand it, People don't like it if you literally interpret the Bible, but if you don't literally interpret it, then it doesn't mean much after a while. So in that case, it was an unconditional promise from God to Abraham, and it still stands. And he's kept his word of bringing the people together once again in these days. So we can see his hand.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Again, we do have copies of Saturday People, Sunday People available, and we will have Lela stand up here on the stage to continue signing and conversation if you would like. Thank you for your kind attention.